Oh, Mari, are you, thank you, ma'am.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all for sticking around. I know we are at the very bitter end of the SCTE cable show, but I could not be more pleased to share the stage next with the CIO and CTO of the city of New Orleans. And I will say that I've gotten to know Jonathan over the last couple of months in conversations. I've had the privilege to know Kim and to have had many conversations with her over the last couple of years. So please give a warm round of applause for Kim and for Jonathan, and let's bring them to the stage. Come closer. No reason to get far away.
Great.
I won't bite, probably.
Okay. Great.
So again, it's such a privilege to have you both here, and I'm so grateful that you can come and share a little bit with this community what it's like from the city of New Orleans perspective. We are here to talk about smart cities, but I want to do that, I want to lead up to that by talking about connectivity, data, and then kind of how those two things merge into what we talk about as smart cities, and obviously there are a number of different definitions. But let's start with something that I know is near and dear to your heart, which is give us a snapshot of where connectivity and broadband and the digital inclusion movement are right now in New Orleans, and what you believe needs to happen to make sure that all citizens get connected.
So first, our city suffers many of the same disparities that other cities do in the distribution of broadband and high access to internet services. 60% of our low-income residents do not have access to broadband and internet services, while 100% of our high-income residents do. So we've got a digital divide to address in the city, and looking for strategic ways to enable and increase the adoption of broadband technologies and internet usage in our residents that have either are in a part of marginalized communities or in low-income communities. So that's kind of where we are as a city. And our efforts, our digital equity efforts are focused around just that.
And what do you think it will take? I mean, what are your partnerships like at the moment with the network service providers? And there's a range of them. And where would you like to take it? How would you like to see that evolve?
So most of our providers we're service-based, right? Mm-hmm. So providing services directly to the city is the primary focus of our partnerships now. We're looking to leverage those relationships to lessen our digital divide, to be more strategic about the digitally redlined areas and how we engage those partners, and to make those areas more accessible for them, to incentivize them to provide more service, more robust service, improve the service in those areas. And I know that that's not an easy thing to do, and that request comes at a great expense to a provider, because there is infrastructure and there are capital investments that they need to make. So we're looking for creative partnerships and ways that we could leverage our resources along with theirs to make that happen and to increase the adoption of services.
One of the things that we heard earlier this morning from some of the cities that we had on stage was specifically around how both sides of those partnerships need to be able to be a little more flexible and a little more creative and a little more holistic. I'd love to hear from you as well, John, about what it is you think that beyond just connecting the people, how you see this connectivity and some of the things that network providers can offer. What kinds of government services, how can you make citizens' lives better beyond making sure that all people are connected, which is definitely a very important first step?
Sure. Well, I think first off, it's really important to understand that really the way that we visualize connectivity and access isn't just necessarily hitting the bare minimum of they have access to the internet, but that they have
you may need to talk a little bit more.
But that they have equitable and fair access as well. And so I think when we are talking with service providers and we're trying to understand how to best partner with them to put forward our initiatives, I think one thing we really try to stress with them is we're not just here to check boxes and be able to provide a sort of base level of service. We want to make sure that when we're providing service, we're doing it in a holistic fashion. fashion, and we're doing it in an equitable fashion. And I think in general, what we've seen is really strong support from our local service providers for those types of efforts, because they really see it as a value add to their brand, as something that they can promote and show how they're connected to the community and how they're investing in the community. And so I think finding that nexus of being able to show where it gives a value to them to be able to provide this sort of thing, and where we can find a real clear value as well, is important. And then in terms of how it directly impacts the delivery of government services, I think we're still developing a lot of emerging partnerships in this area, but the area that we're most mature in probably is our public safety sector, and where we've seen really strong improvements in the connectivity that are facilitated certainly by new emerging technologies, but also by really strong investments and partnerships with the private sector as well. And I think really some of the forefront efforts of that really revolve around our real-time crime center, which is now processing an enormous amount of information, over 300 cameras networked and deployed throughout the city. They have access to real-time footage. We've networked them and connected them to our dispatch center, our communication center, and now we're starting to invest in really making the mobile command centers in our individual cars, so that you now have in a police car or an ambulance access to an amount of information that you really never had before, and you can directly use that to benefit the services you're providing.
And how much do you rely on city resources and city infrastructure and the networks and all the other types of infrastructure that you may be invested in and continue to maintain? And how much do you rely on partners for making some of those things happen? So, for example, a real-time traffic control center, I've seen that in a number of different cities, and there are different ways that those have grown up and evolved. So what piece comes internally from the city, and then what comes externally from partners?
So I think the challenge that every city faces obviously is limited resources, and there's only so much that we can invest in these large upfront infrastructure costs.
Right.
I think we prioritize what are the really bread and butter municipal service issues, which is generally public safety, in making those investments. I think that when we're looking at those sort of other spaces of government services, to make the type of investment that you need to start to develop those capacities, you really do need strong investment and partnership from the private sector level, because we can't sit here and fantasize that we're going to get $50 million to invest in the next year or two. But a private sector company that looks at the economics and says, you know what, here's some ways that we can start to monetize parts of this, they may be willing to and open to a partnership with us. And so I think trying to identify those sectors that maybe your limited amount of infrastructure funding can't support, while still continuing to invest what you can in your very core baseline services, is sort of the most feasible approach to trying to get that infrastructure investment kicked off.
And Kim, how do you view that? Because I know some of the projects in New Orleans, from a government perspective, I know you have invested specifically in making sure that you have got fiber lines out to particular data centers. Yes. There are things that you own and maintain. As you look out into the future, how much of that business do you want to be in, and how much do you want the partners to come to the table, and what would you like from them?
So what we're doing is we're supplementing our service provider network. We're still heavily service provider dependent, right? On connectivity. So we want to build, along with that service provider network, infrastructure that the city can own and leverage, but leverage for the distribution of equitable services and the efficiency of city-related services. So we're not in the business of providing service to
You're not selling broadband, right?
Absolutely not. Yep, we never want to be there. But we do want to reduce our dependencies on just the service providers as it relates to delivering service. So some ways we do that is building capacity internally.
Okay.
So that is having experienced staff to manage our end-to-end connectivity, work very closely with our service providers. We'd like to start making some shifts in investment so that we have infrastructure that we build, and we still will be working with our service providers to maintain and operate those networks. But where we can improve efficiencies, the products and the technologies have changed over time. We're less land-centric right now, and we're more mobile-centric. Our police cars, our ambulances, they're moving. They are mobile technologies. This information is heavily dependent on their ability to respond quickly as they're moving. So we've moved from just a connected infrastructure to more of a ubiquitous infrastructure. But the backhaul and the infrastructure that moves those IoT devices and our mobility devices we want to be thoughtful about how we rebuild that infrastructure. So the city does have a strategic plan to build more capacity that we maintain. And we're looking to our service providers to shift from maybe the wired infrastructure to more of the wireless infrastructure that we have.
And from a strategic or advisory perspective, how much do you think that you potentially can rely on the service provider partners that you do have to say, okay, here's what we're looking at from a landscape point of view. Here are some of the things that we know that we want to control, but we don't necessarily know the best ways to lay all of this out. We don't necessarily, you have a few things going on in your job. You're not necessarily following the latest developments in some of the research. What about from an advisory or strategic perspective in working with the network providers? Do you think there are opportunities there?
Oh, absolutely. And John is great at creating strategy for us, right?
Okay.
And we know public safety is our space where we're most mature, and right now where we're most interested in developing those partnerships. But we do have an overall strategy for the city, and we like to engage our providers and let them know what that strategy is and offer them opportunities to tell us where they best fit, where their technologies best fit, where we should have our own infrastructure, and where it's best for us to depend on someone else to do those things. There are expertise that we will never have. And from a resource perspective, there's capacity that we just cannot build. Even the speed at which technology advances, somebody's going to be a little more experienced than us, right? So it is our responsibility to have a good strategy, to understand the maturations in areas where there's public safety, transportation, medical, healthcare, whether it's just providing services and digital equity services to our citizens. It's our responsibility to make those things available to our partners and then allow them to tell us where they can best help.
I do want to get back to that because part of a discussion that we had earlier was around how do you get the right people to the table, both from the industry side and from the municipality or the regional or the local government side. But before we dig a little bit deeper into that, I do want to switch over to the data piece because this is incredibly relevant. There are lots of things that still need to be figured out in terms of how data is used, how it may be monetized in the future, how it makes citizens' lives better. And I'd like to start, John, maybe on the open data movement, which feels like old news because it's been many years since the city started working on making a lot of their data open, making it available in open portals, and even starting to build some analytics tools into there and opening them up with APIs. But that said, it may look very sophisticated. There's still a limit in terms of the data feeds that are going into that. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how data has changed how you think about governing and how you think about government services and kind of where that evolution has been over the last several years.
Sure, and I think it also ties in well with our discussion of how we partner with the private sector, because this ends up being one of the key sort of issues that need to be resolved when you're doing these types of partnerships. So I think the really important thing to take away, and I don't think we're the only ones that have this philosophy, but the open data movement, I think, has really ingrained within our city a strong citizen first and transparency philosophy that really allows us to prioritize and forces us to prioritize the openness and transparency of our data. And so as we're going into new contracts with vendors, as we're starting to plan out future investments, we're specifically planning those to allow accommodations for that data to be eventually released so that other entities can start to use it in a profitable fashion, right? And that is open, so we allow a certain amount of transparency with our citizens. And I think, inherently there's some conflict there between a pure openness and a desire to monetize data. Right. And a lot of times when you're entering into good public partnerships, a little bit of a tongue twister there, what the entity, the private entity engaging with you is doing is generally giving up some immediate costs that they're having to incur for future profitability. And sometimes that profitability revolves around a model of monetizing the data that's being produced by it. And what the city's contributing oftentimes is some sort of city asset, whether that be actual right-of-way and ability to invest on city infrastructure, or whether it be a more amorphous sort of endorsement of the city in the the sort of political support that comes with that. And I think that leads to potentially some sort of hard negotiations at times where there is a conflict between we'd like to release this data and make sure that everyone can benefit from it, and then the company saying, well, we're investing money here, we have skin in the game, we need to make sure that we can find a way to profit off this as well. And so I think that's really where we've been led to at this point, is that there are going to be, on an ongoing basis, those types of project-specific conflicts that have to be worked through. And I think the important thing is to understand that it's our philosophy in the open data movement, it's not going away. It's not going to get weaker. It's been institutionalized at this point. We have it now in policy, we have it in law, and we have it as a culture really within our city. And so I think understanding that when you come to the table from the private sector is really important, and finding some way to work within that structure to still realize the revenue streams that you need to realize is really key to making those partnerships successful going forward.
That's a great perspective. What kinds of data sets are we talking about at this point? And I've talked to a number of cities and communities at this point. I've heard some crazy stories that range from, rodent traps, connected rodent traps, and feeding information about how those are operating out in the field, precision agriculture, to to restaurant health inspections. I mean, there's a tremendous amount. What kind of data are you collecting? What kind of data are you looking for? And how do you see that? Is it all still static at this point, or are we moving to that sort of real-time data level?
I think we're moving to that level, but the main impediment, of course, is investment in sensory infrastructure.
Okay.
And that's a hurdle for us, obviously, for the reasons we've talked about in terms of having limited capital invest. That's where those public-private partnerships really need to come to play to allow us to make those investments and benefit from them. And that's sort of where those issues need to be worked through primarily. I would say that in terms of what our open data sets are, some of them are certainly somewhat static. Whenever possible, we try to use as much dynamic data as we can. But I think that really I don't know if anything really makes us unique in this world at this point, but I think where we maybe have a little bit more progress to show is really in what's one of the harder open data sectors, which is criminal justice. That's a world that has traditionally been shrouded in secrecy, and it's heavily protected, that data. And really, under the prior presidential administration, they launched a police open data initiative that we were one of the original signers to, and we really used that as momentum to go through data set by data set all of our policing data and release everything that we thought we really could that doesn't have identifiable information to it to the public. And that's really important in our community because we have a history of unconstitutional policing. We're under a consent decree currently. And so starting to rebuild that trust with the community has been a real focus of the police department over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think that open data has really served as one of the platforms to do that, is to say, we're not trying to hide anything. We want you to help us police ourselves. We need you to help show us if there's things that we're doing that are creating additional disparities. And so I think that's one area that we've really been a leader on within the open data movement.
And what's been the reaction to that? I mean, is there a backlash from being that transparent?
I think there's skepticism initially at the rank and file level. The initial meetings about these things tend to be, no, you can't release that, right? But then once you start to take the time to really walk through it with them step by step and say, this piece of information, what is it that this provides that gives you concern? And once you start to identify where those pain points are, and you can show them that you're willing to accommodate things that they have reasonable arguments should not be released, then I think that you really start to get more buy-in. And I would say that initially on this effort, we had a fair amount of resistance. Yeah. Now I would say there really isn't any to speak of. You might find a malcontent here or there, but I think in general, it's become a fact of life. And that's what tends to happen with the open data movement, right? Is initially people are like, well, transparency, that could lead us to accountability. I don't want to be held accountable. But then once it gets out there and you realize, generally speaking, when people are using it, they're using it in a way to try to better the environment for everyone, not to find one particular person. And I know this is a long answer, but just one quick example on that.
Go ahead.
Really, the most controversial data set we released was our internal investigation data set of our misconduct investigations. And there was a lot of consternation about being able to associate multiple cases with a single officer, and the fear that people would kind of go out there and use that to target people and say, you know, this is a bad cop. And obviously we weren't releasing the actual information about that person, but we wanted to have some kind of unique identifier so people could see how cases were distributed among officers. And that was the initial fear. We sort of broke through that, and I don't think that they've seen anything of that sort of worst case scenario that they envisioned, and the fact that that has not happened has kind of led them to sort of accept that as a daily fact.
I do love the idea that once you start doing something, it becomes institutionalized pretty quickly, and once you've changed what those norms are, then it just becomes de facto, and that's the way that you operate. I do want to go back. You mentioned some of the sensor-driven projects, and maybe we tie that in a little bit to the connectivity and that infrastructure. What are some of the projects that you are considering that would be high priority for the city of New Orleans that you think would be? Public safety obviously sounds like it's top on the list, but as you're looking to get more information from the physical world around you, from the networks that are already deployed, what types of projects, smart city, sensor-driven projects are you considering?
Well, you all have been lucky, kind of. It hasn't rained since you've been here, I don't think. But if you spend some sizable amount of time here, you'll realize pretty quickly that one of our biggest issues is stormwater management.
Sure.
And we flood extremely easily. And so one of the big projects that was launched this year with sensory infrastructure is really the deployment of flooding sensors at major intersections under underpasses at the highway to really be able to provide residents in real time with information about which roads are flooded so they could avoid them. Because what happens is, you know, you start to get a little traffic in that area, people get bogged down, they get flooded, cars start getting abandoned, and all of a sudden you've created a new public safety catastrophe that could have been avoided if people just didn't try to drive there. So that's really one thing, you know, we've tried to focus on. And then I would say we're currently working on ways to try to expand our reach in the transportation sector. You know, it's something that this administration in particular has prioritized. They relaunched the Department of Transportation, which this city hadn't had for at least a decade, probably a couple decades, to really focus on a more holistic city role in transportation planning. So we didn't abdicate that to all the regional transportation agencies that traditionally have had a stronger role there.
Go ahead, please.
I'll back up just a bit.
Sure.
Blight for New Orleans, we were very interested in our recovery. So we gained a lot of trust with the public. We got a head start on open data and those initiatives by looking at something that was very relevant to our citizens, our constituents, and that was how the city recovered after Hurricane Katrina. So that was our head start, that was our skin in the game, that was a buy-in from residents, and our focus has been on the things that are most relevant. So we went from blight to tackling crime under our consent decree. Our plan is generally to take the most relevant issues that the city is facing. Water and resilience will always be important to us, will remain constantly one of our most important drivers. So we can always go back to that. We can always look at that example and say, this is how we use data to recover our city. This is how we're going to continue to use data. Now we're going to add new technologies to bring more data here. And that is going to continue to improve the lives of our citizens, aid in our recovery, and avoid or prevent future disasters. Yeah. So starting with the flood sensors, then it allows us to tackle more common problems. And transportation is one of them. Moving people in and out of the city when there is an event, and we do events very well here, but even when there is a disaster.
Traffic or construction as well. Yes.
Traffic, construction, but if there is a life-threatening event, we have to think about how we use data to help us to plan. Our government and our city leadership has become very data dependent. Data for decision making has taken a turn from being something where we hand static reports to a tool that they expect to be very dynamic and very useful. So having those drivers in our overall strategy has been really important, and it aids the adoption of new sensor technologies. They become less about playing with technology toys and more relevant to the work that the city has to do to continue to make lives better, right?
How do you coordinate? So if you're talking about a Department of Transportation, you're talking about public safety, or you're talking about public works, especially from this audience perspective, from the private sector. I know that a lot of times businesses will go directly to a source, a department, something to try to get a project off the ground.
Right.
How do they engage with you more holistically so they can think about not just a project, but how it fits into a broader strategy, which is good for both sides?
We've got to start with having our strategy.
Okay.
We have to internally speak about what the city's goals are. So I'm going to now punt to John, who's really responsible for
Make
strategy.
him solve it, right.
And
You have to have a strategy, and you have to communicate that strategy in a way that it's clear how it will benefit the business needs that that department is trying to address. And I think that generally speaking, when we first sort of came into office about 1.5 years ago, I would say there was sort of a lack of centralization on IT investment, and departments were really kind of moving forward with their own investments without necessarily a lot of IT involvement, at least at the front end. Certainly at the back end, when things start to go wrong and they realize they don't have the capacity to do it, then of course they're more than willing to call us. But at the beginning part, sometimes that was lacking. And so really the first thing that we tried to do was first, what's really important is top level executive buy-in. We've received really tremendous support from our top level executives for implementing a centralized IT strategy. And without that type of support, you're really not able to corral the many people that have really, in some cases, urgent business needs. They can't afford to wait 5 years for you to say, oh, well, that's on our long-term plan. We're going to invest on it in 5 years. Don't worry about it. They know that there's too many variables there for them to control. They want to see what is going to happen in the near future and how you can meet their immediate needs. And so what we tried to do is have our strategy, but also be flexible so that we can find interim solutions when needed that meet those crucial business needs, but don't detract from the overall strategic approach.
I'm curious, and we have such a short amount of time left, it goes so fast. Are there partners that you have from the private sector that you feel like have come in and done a good job at looking at whatever your strategy is or helping you figure out the long-term game as opposed to just the short sale? Are there examples out there? And I say this knowing that earlier on we had some cities who were very optimistic and positive about the way their communities are moving, and I think we have a huge spectrum. I don't know that it's that rosy in every community across the country. We're getting there, but I don't think we're there. So are there partners or examples that you would give to the audience in terms of who's done this well?
So certainly, but I don't know that I want to get to the exact example level on this. This is what I would say, right? Vendors and private sector partners can really that you know what it is you're trying to do and how you'd like to do it. And when you have a fractured approach to that and it's inconsistent, then the best partner in the world can't help you, right? They're just going to toss more and more resources down that black hole. And so our first priority has been, let's get a real solid understanding of what our interests are, the things we're trying to get, and then let's engage with partners. And so I think we've started to build really positive relationships with a number of partners. I don't know that any of them are necessarily mature enough to go into here, but I would say that you can't get to that level unless you know what you're asking and what you're trying to do. If you're going to someone else and expecting them to help define what your problems are and what your needs are, I think that you're really not doing enough of a service and providing enough of a foundation for that partnership to build off of.
Do you think you've done the work that you need to do internally at this point to be having more of those conversations?
we're doing it.
Okay.
I believe we're doing it.
Yeah.
So we're looking at legislation, we're looking at franchise agreements, we're looking at ways that the existing service providers understand our goals. Our existing telcos, our existing cable providers understand where we are, that they understand digital equity and its importance in our community, that they know that we know they're digitally redlined areas. We have to make those things very clear, and I can't say that our partners haven't been responsive, but internally, our work is to collectively look at what makes it easier for us to build those partnerships, and whether that is corralling our internal agencies, our public-private partners, our economic development engines, looking at opportunities in the grant space and the opportunity zones, and saying, these are the places where we could make these improvements, and who's playing in that space.
Right.
Which of those partners, which of those service providers are interested in these initiatives or have some skin in these games. That makes it much easier for us to do our work.
That makes a lot of sense. Because we're down to the last few seconds here, are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave, in particular with this audience, which has a very particular viewpoint on smart cities?
I would just say that the number one thing I think that I would sort of recommend to a private sector partner that's looking to engage with the public sector is at the start and outside of that engagement, take some time to try to understand and to prod that local government, if they're not being forthcoming with this, what their main pain points are and what structures they need to work within. And I think the biggest point of frustration that private sector has is on procurement. And that is so unique by local entity, and it's often not very flexible. And so there's certain constraints that your partner is working under that may seem silly to you, it may seem silly to them as well, but they ultimately still have to be in that structure. And so understanding and respecting that and taking time to learn and understand those concerns, I think is really the foundation of building those partnerships.
Any last word, Kim?
That's it.
That was it. You did it. You summed it up. All right. Well, for those of you who are left here to the bitter end, please help me give a warm round of applause to our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. LaGrue, Mr. Wisbey. Great first-hand information from the streets. I appreciate it.